Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to give you some info about this one reading. This is the reading by Gordon Wood, and this is called Radical Possibilities of the American Revolution. It's based on a book written by Gordon Wood, and it's one that he won the Pulitzer Prize for. And so it's a notable book amongst, kind of the history of the American Revolution. This excerpt is from a book called Major Problems in American History, Volume 1. And so it is a, kind of an excerpted edition. So we're looking at some of Gordon Wood's work, but not necessarily the whole complete text. And a little bit about Gordon Wood. He's a college professor. He's retired now, but he started teaching at Brown probably back in the 60s, maybe the late 60s. So he's somebody who has been around for a while and writing about the Revolutionary War. One of the debates that historians have gotten into about the revolution is how much it has created some degree of social change. So most historians would agree that there's definitely political change. We see independence and we see, no more monarch, and, the colonies become states, and the Constitution, and all those various things that maybe we can argue are part of the American Revolution. But the question about social change, do we really see, for example, people's status in society change? And some historians argue that no, at the end of the day, the Revolutionary War doesn't really shift, who has power in society. And folks like Gordon Wood, to some degree also Gary Nash, although in a different way, also take on the argument that maybe there is some degree of social change. Maybe it's happening in really specific ways and not necessarily the way that, the entire class system, for example, doesn't get recreated in 1787. The Constitution puts in place, for example, slavery, which is very much something that we see during the Revolutionary War. But at the same time, there's some argument that maybe within some states in the North in the 1780s, 1790s, into the early 1800s, some northern states will start to create laws that prohibit slavery in their states, and how much that's connected to the Revolutionary War. Other things like the Enlightenment, is kind of part of where we're going with this. So Gordon Wood is one of the historians who's commenting on that larger question about how revolutionary was the revolution, and is there really something to be said for some degree of social change. And, like a lot of historians, he kind of sets this up. So I'm just going to use the text itself and point out a few things. He does start out with the 1760s and the 1770s, suggesting that, there is some potential revolution. He also says that, it's not really typical thing that we associate with revolution. So we don't have mass poverty, no social discontent. We don't have the masses that are, kind of clamoring for something different. He makes a case that actually people in the colonies are doing very, very well. They're very prosperous, and lots of people have a prosperity that maybe they wouldn't have had elsewhere. So, there is a lot of people that, and he kind of says that there's greater prosperity. The experience of growing prosperity contributed to this sense that people were capable of ordering their own reality. What was made could be unmade, so maybe a little bit of like an empowerment for the colonists, and that people were nervous about maintaining their prosperity. So they had this like economic prosperity, and they're interested in, trying to keep it. He also suggests that lots of social change was happening, and, religious dissent, for example, the rich becoming richer. So even though the colonies are very prosperous, the gap between rich and poor might be getting more significant. And the number of poor in some of the cities, that this might be something, like people were seeing some of this, okay? And, he also makes the case at the end, this kind of provocative, paragraph, that even though the society is becoming more unequal, we're seeing greater gap in between rich and poor, for example. It's the equality of American society that's causing the problems. Okay, and so he makes this case then that's a little bit different. Since equality and prosperity are unusual, people were like desperate to preserve them. And he talks about the concept of work and suggests that maybe in Europe, the way in which people thought of work, it was essentially servitude. So everybody is thinking of work as servitude. Now, clearly, there are people in the colonies who are involved in servitude, but in the case of what Wood is trying to suggest, he's saying, that there is this, sense that increased productivity, this, prosperity is connected to, maybe a work space that is different, and people feel very productive. And this productivity is like an opportunity of sorts, and people are looking to, maintain this. Okay. That the issue of going back into a servitude type of situation is problematic to people. And then he starts paragraph 3 by saying, America is no doubt the best poor man's country in the world. And, he also does note that there is a great deal of inequality. So there is a society where we have, what he describes as slavery, and that people are very sensitive to the various dependencies and subordinations that still lurked everywhere in their lives. So, this idea that there is like this older feudal world that exists that you probably learned about a little bit last year when you learned about the Middle Ages, that we kind of have, servants and vassals are very dependent on a class of people that is the aristocracy and the lords. And that particular aristocracy basically had all of the power and all of the control, and everyone else was kind of dependent on that class for their food, for their keep, everything. And in this case, in the colonies, it doesn't appear to be that way, but fear that there would be that type of vassalage or enslavement again. Okay. So even though, there is this discussion about, slavery, that there exists racialized slavery, people are very, very, and white people are afraid of becoming dependent on a rich upper class. So, clearly a lot of irony in this concept of liberty, but this idea that people are, trying to ensure, like that they are able to protect this kind of newly found feeling of not being kind of enslaved to somebody at a higher, kind of status. And then he says, by the middle of the century, these social changes are being expressed in politics. Okay. He says right before this, that there are, the typical ties that are hierarchical, patronage and, kinship, the things that the aristocracy may be dependent on. Some of that might be diminishing in the colonies. Okay. And then he says, in the place of politics, we start to see some of this happen, right? And so, he says no authority could relax, no ruler could long remain unchallenged. Lots of ordinary people are participating in electoral politics, and he's talking about in the colonies, so in these town meetings and contested elections for assembly seats and things like that. And he makes a point to say this is not because the masses are up in arms and trying to say we need something. It's actually because the competing gentry, the wealthy class, needs to court people in order to win in a more democratic space. So they are looking for more numbers of people to support them. So people are like the counterweights to be used. And this is like kind of a counterweight in a sense to royal authority. So some of the people that might have some degree of political power would include people that England has put on the ground to oversee some of the colonial legislatures, but now we get this like popular participation in politics, and it kind of becomes a thing. So he makes a case that on the eve of the revolution, there are these like monarchical ways of governing through kin and patronage that have been like kind of transformed, and people start to see politics as something that they too can have a part of. So weakening of family connections, kind of noble names. And in England, this exists in a space like people are born with a literal title and they have paperwork that supports their bloodline to that particular title. It's almost like a pedigree of sorts, in the way we would attach to like, dogs that are competing for prizes, right? In the colonies, we don't have that type of, they're still wealthy families, but we don't necessarily have that same type of title in a way. And we also get a sense in paragraph 5 that there are some ways that governors are trying to restrict this, right? Somebody even suggests introducing titled nobility into America to stabilize colonial society. So the royals are kind of recognizing that there is popular sentiments, and those sentiments have a political realm, okay? We get a sense in paragraph 6 that, everything changes in 1763. This is when the French and Indian War ends, and we start to get the, realm of King George III, who becomes a royal in 1760. And we also get, sort of this, we know what's going to be the proclamation of 1763, and ultimately things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and that sort of thing. So American revolutionaries are not, he says, this is Gordon Wood's words, are not simply expressing resentment of corrupt political practices. They're actually tearing at the bonds of this like monarchical society. So he's kind of making a case it wasn't only the monarch, but the group of people who were loyal to the monarch and perhaps got their bread and butter and everything, they held power because they were attached to the monarch. Some of these ties are getting sliced, and so something is changing in the colonies in terms of like the mindset, right? And he says, this isn't your typical revolution. We're not talking about like some Marxist thing like the poor and the rich and the workers and the employers, or Democrats and aristocrats. He's kind of suggesting a like almost feudal version of this. Courtiers, so people who have a rank that comes from hereditary or personal connections. And these are people who generally have privilege and live to maintain their privilege. So they exist to maintain their privilege. Patriots, on the other hand, are those who are free. So they're not dependent on anyone else, and their position or their talent, comes from, or rather their rank, their status in society comes from their own merit, their own talent, right? Recognition by the people. So somebody in the colonies who's noted for doing something significant, say like a Thomas Paine or something like that, is recognized by the people for a particular talent, not because he himself has a piece of paper that says everybody's got to kiss his, okay? So that's kind of where this goes, right? And he kind of describes the way that there is this hierarchical structure of the monarchy in England. We kind of get a sense of the loyalists, who are the loyalists? He basically suggests these are going to be people, who they were. They're going to be, the well-to-do, the very, very wealthy, people who largely were looking to protect their privilege, and people who had a kind of a pedigree in a sense. They don't want to see this monarchical, noble kind of connection disappear because they're part of it. Okay, so people who had family connections, anything that comes from a source of talent, and the will of the people now seems like, anything that's like noble or just, bloodline or whatever seems to be dependent. So this idea of, having raw talent and having raw talent kind of create people's status, to some degree. There's even going to be social mobility from this. That's what Gordon Wood is talking about. Okay. He does talk a little bit about the idea of independence as the opposite of dependence, right? And he talks about this Virginia Declaration of Rights, that property, in a sense, is very much almost like somebody's talent. Carpenter's skill is his property. So, like, we today might call this human capital. All the skills you're working on become like part of your resume, and you'll get paid, based on that human capital, which includes education, but might include other talents. And that's what kind of Gordon Wood is, pointing out. Okay. So that's some of what he's noting in this. And so the, kind of idea